Good morning. It's April 5th, 2016. My name is Dr. Marla Wolfson, and I'm in the Senior Physiologist Lounge at the San Diego Convention Center here at the annual meeting of the American Physiological Society. And today it's my great pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Thomas Shaffer for the Society's Living History Project. Dr. Shaffer is a long-standing member of the American Physiological Society who's been affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, and Thomas Jefferson School of Medicine. He is currently, at present time, affiliated with the Katz School of Medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia, with the Nemours Alfred I. DuPont Hospital for Children in Wilmington, Delaware. And today we're going to have an opportunity to talk with Dr. Shaffer about his journey through his career process and his focus and how he got to the opportunity to focus his research on the area of pulmonary with the emphasis of neonatal and pediatric care. Tom, it's an opportunity, great opportunity to have a chance to talk with you and share your life journey, your professional career with the APS. How are you doing this morning?
Feeling good, Marla. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today and have an opportunity to talk to all the physiologists about their careers and share a little bit about my journey. I guess it's been almost 40 years now from the time I did my postdoctoral fellowship to present day, and it was quite an experience.
Yeah. So what sparked your interest in science?
Well, my interest in science really started in high school. I had the opportunity to enroll in a scientific program as a curriculum in our high school. And the focus was in mathematics and physical science like physics and chemistry. And I think that much of the curiosity started at that time, really.
So after high school, how did you decide on your path to extend that interest in, did you go directly to college? Did you work first? How did that go?
Well, because of the interest that I had in high school, and it more or less came easy to me, in terms of the math and science aspect. My father convinced me that a career in engineering might be a good idea. And my father's background was that he was a marine engineer, was going to college for that, and a machinist, and thought that there would be a lot of opportunities if I did something like that. And so I applied to Drexel University for mechanical engineering and pursued a career in that originally.
So you went through Drexel, and I think that, if I remember correctly, Drexel has the co-op program, and you have an opportunity to experience different areas that you might end up developing a career in. What did you ultimately get your degree in?
Ultimately, I sort of fast-tracked through and went directly from an undergraduate degree to a PhD in applied mechanics and applied math. And as you mentioned, the aspect of the co-op program was very enlightening, because every 6 months you had the opportunity to go out and work in the field and get an idea of not only what you like, but I think for me, it was more important to know what I didn't like and what you could fall back on if you really needed to. But it really developed the curiosity on my part.
So we know that you've been a longstanding member of the APS, and you have an interest in the lung and aspects of pulmonary, and you've had the opportunity to bridge various different disciplines. Can you give us a little bit of insight as how you bridge the discipline of applied mathematics and engineering into ultimately the physical aspects of how the organ systems work together, and specifically the lung?
Sure. Long-standing is kind of a good word to use, and it's been over 40 years since I made the transition from engineering and mathematics into, let's say, physiology to start with, and medicine. And the engineering principles associated with control engineering, how systems work. For a number of my different co-op jobs, I worked in the aerospace industry as a, quote, rocket scientist for a while. And the understanding of those control systems led me to think more about other types of applications. And in Drexel, we were pursuing the respiratory system in terms of one of my mentors was keenly interested in diving, and respiration, of course, was tied into that particular area of research. And I felt like I didn't know quite enough about the biology aspect. And so after graduating from Drexel in working in all these mathematical systems and control systems, I decided to do a postdoc in the medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. And I had read the Handbook of Physiology over and over, all the various aspects of it. And in doing that, I came across some of the individuals at the University of Pennsylvania who had written a number of chapters in that book. And I thought this would be an interesting way to go to pursue and expand my understanding of the biological systems. So for the first several years in my postdoc, I basically audited medical school classes and learned as much as I could about respiratory physiology and the mechanics of breathing, the control system of breathing, and et cetera.
So you had an opportunity to work with some really good people at Drexel in your basic fundamental understanding of engineering and control systems, and then, as I'm understanding, you chose the next step in your educational development to understand more about human physiology, and you sought out leaders in that field. Who are some of the people that you had an opportunity to work with in terms of leadership of pulmonary physiology, for example?
Yes.
I know Penn was a big mover and shaker in those days.
Yes. At that time, University of Pennsylvania was a powerhouse with regard to respiratory physiology. And the chairman of the department was Robert Foster, who had done an enormous amount of work in diffusion. And another individual there was Arthur Du Bois, who had done all the early work in terms of how you could diagnostically come up with a method for determining airway resistance. And it's something that's extremely important, for example, in both health and disease, exercise physiology, as well as different types of pathologies, such as asthma. And at the same time, there was both in the medical area, Albert Fishman, who was the chief of pulmonary medicine, and on the other hand, there was Christian Lamberson, who had done all the environmental respiratory work for diving medicine, and basically wrote the handbook on the dive tables for the Navy. So there were so many different directions to go in there, and the leadership really was inspiring in terms of working with the people who actually did the fundamental discoveries for respiration.
So here you come with a very strong engineering background, and now you've developed a very living understanding of human physiology and working with super leadership in developing concepts in the field at a very fundamental level. And you then moved on, as I understand, to sort of bridge that gap from a control system, machine operation concept to how the lung functions. And then my understanding is that you had experience with alternative respiratory media, which has really expanded from bench to bedside. Can you give our listening community some insight as how you took your fundamental engineering concepts, integrated it with organ physiology, and then took this concept of an alternative respiratory media from bench to bedside and, steps along the way?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was almost a matter of necessity in terms of when I was in the engineering aspect of my life. I was working with Gordon Moskowitz at Drexel University, who was an avid diver, and he had a great deal of interest in the hyperbaric aspects of how the respiratory system worked. And one of the complications associated with diving deep is decompression sickness and the problems surrounding that. And at that time, there was this concept that was out there in that you could actually breathe a liquid if you chose the right liquid. The only complicating factor associated with breathing those liquids was that to breathe a liquid opposed to a gas requires more work on the part of a human because of the viscosity and the physical properties of a liquid opposed to a gas. And so it was necessary for me to learn a lot more about the mechanics of breathing and the respiratory control system, which the relationship between Gordon Moskowitz and some of the individuals at the University of Pennsylvania sort of made the marriage for me to get involved with that. And it was a fork in the road for me to take that pathway, to learn more about that.
So that's a really interesting segue as an opportunity to bridge your fundamental understanding of engineering and then finding an unmet need with respect to the lung and having the opportunity to work in your graduate degree for the diving application. But how did you move that on to a normal environment but an impaired lung?
Well, once again, it's a matter of being prepared and having an opportunity. Preparation and opportunity. And at that time, in the early 70s, there were complicating factors that were going on in the world with regard to premature infants. It wasn't long after, in the early 70s, where the President of the United States, in terms of John Kennedy, had a premature baby who died of respiratory distress. And the standards at that time were very different than the standards today. However, his baby, Patrick, was 1,500 grams, which is, by today's standard, not a tiny baby. Was 34 weeks gestation, which by today's standard is not really that young. But there was no technique, and there was not a doctor in the country that could keep that baby safe. Mm-hmm. And that created quite a stir in terms of something needs to be done here. Mm-hmm. And there was a movement in terms of how could we help premature babies have a better outcome in life. And working at the University of Pennsylvania and working with those who were interested in taking care of patients, either adult patients or infants at this time, was the opportunity to apply the use of that liquid approach for normal environments with individuals that had abnormal lungs. And it becomes a little bit complicated in terms of, for the average person, thinking about why would you want to breathe a liquid opposed to breathing a gas. And it's really related to the physics and the biophysics associated with that a lung born prematurely doesn't have the right machinery in place in terms of the lung itself is not completely developed such that it can expand easily like a full-term infant's lung. And it can expand because of the tissue properties of the lung as well as the surface properties in terms of surface tension. And normally when we're born as a full-term infant, that lung is completely developed with a system which we call the surfactant system, in which there's plenty of surfactant available to allow the lung to lower the surface tension such that every time you take a breath, it doesn't require that much energy. And that was the problem facing these premature infants.
It's very interesting, and we're at a time where each of the basic science entities, whether it's physiology, biochemistry, et cetera, is that we're all working together towards a common goal. And here you started doing that, clearly 30, 35 years ago. What kind of, or even maybe even a little bit longer than that ago, what kind of advice would you have for people starting out now, understanding that there's still the need to understand and represent your basic discipline, but how do you go out and make your discipline just as an important of a player as other disciplines, and actually work, as we know, translational medicine is the way we need to go. What kind of hurdles and what kind of strategies did you incorporate at that time that you think may still be relevant, or maybe some things that you would have done differently in order to really capitalize on your strong engineering background, your strong physiology background, to take these concepts that perhaps have mechanical basis but truly have treatment or therapeutic application? What kind of advice would you have, or what kind of pearls could you share with our listening?
Well, it comes down to what you're talking about is interdisciplinary work and translational research. And I think it is, as the Beatles talked about, a little help from my friends in terms of, I come from a background of the physical world and the mathematical world, and I was working with those that were from the biological world, life sciences. And each of us have skill sets, but each of us have limitations. And sometimes it's really necessary for that collaboration to take place to get a good result. And I think it turned out to be a perfect match in that regard, in terms of, I was working with individuals that did not have the skill set that I had, and I didn't have the skill set that they had. And it enabled us to do some things to forge frontiers that people hadn't considered before.
So we all know that you have great ideas. If someone has a great idea, that it takes a little bit more than elbow grease and energy and stamina and tenacity to make something happen. We know that there has to be funding behind that. And you've had a very successful career of funding track record from the early 70s now, hopefully to the foreseeable future. What kind of challenges did you come up against in your early career? Did those challenges resurface at any time? And what kind of suggestions would you have for people to access funding, types of funding? How do you keep yourself moving forward at a time when the budget is constantly being constrained?
Yes, that's a situation that all scientists have to go through, and I have to admit, it was a very up and down path. And the issue is that if you have the training and you have the skill set, you have to maintain your positive attitude that you will prevail. Now, I think that I was very fortunate in that I happened to be in this environment where there were very good mentors and were able to direct me to get started on the right path. And when I look back on it, 1973, when I submitted my first grant, I was advised how to do that, what my short-term goals, what my long-term goals were, submitted the grant, and it was funded. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I could make a career out of this. Write a grant, submit a grant, get funded, do the work, write some papers, submit another grant, so on and so forth. However, it wasn't too long where I realized that that turned out to be somewhat of a roller coaster ride. And it's important that you get validation for what you're doing from this external funding, because when you apply to the outside world and your peers evaluate what you're doing, and they're the ones that provide you with the financial support to pursue your work, it's very meaningful. However, my advice is that you should not put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to that. And because if you look back from the 70s until now, the funding from the government, whether it be NIH funding or NSF funding or even foundation money, it's a roller coaster ride. It's up and down. So it is very important to diversify your portfolio in terms of funding sources. And there's another component to it, in that if you're interested in translational research, which you mentioned, in terms of that if you're trying to take something from the bench to the bedside, there are many challenges other than just being supported for the benchtop work. It takes support from industry, either from biomedical instrumentation, if you're doing diagnostics, to pharmaceutical companies, if you're doing interventions with drugs. Because in order to get it to a patient, it has to go through a regulatory process associated with the FDA. And that's not an easy task for a scientist to do solo. And once again, it comes down to help from your friends in terms of the right connections and the right support system. And so by interacting with the NIH and NSF, you're getting validation for your work, which is important. But working with industry takes the next step towards getting it to the patients and to the bedside. And so they can help you in many ways, and not just financially, but also through those regulatory steps to take it through the FDA.
Yeah. It's an interesting time that we're living through now in terms of the challenges of finances. It's also a time of great opportunity. And as you mentioned, that those of us, and you certainly explained the longevity of your funding and the concept of not putting your eggs in one basket and diversifying your funding profile. If I recall from your CV, you've also have had some good opportunities in technology transfer and intellectual property development, research and development. Can you speak to perhaps the junior scientists who are coming up to the importance of speaking your mind, making your concepts known, documenting your concepts, getting protection for your concepts, and to what end that has brought success to your career?
Yes, that is an important issue, and I guess the dogma for academic work, university, professional schools, medicine, etc., was always publish or perish, and that it was important to take your work and make sure that you published it in high-level impact journals. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when you come up with new concepts and new ideas, it's important that they become protected, because in order to make that last step for the translational component, to take it from the bench to the bedside, there has to be an intervention from industry or big pharma to take it that step. And their involvement requires that they have some stake in the game and protection. I mean, for them to invest an enormous amount of money into a technology, they have to be sure that someone else is not going to take that from them. And that's exactly what you're alluding to, is how do you make sure that that happens? And the one mechanism for that is to go through the process of getting patents, intellectual property, such that you're protected, your university is protected, and then if you have the opportunity to license it to a pharmaceutical company or a biomedical organization that can develop instrumentation, they are protected as well.
Now, the idea of intellectual property and tech transfer in terms of protecting your idea and also having a funding pathway to bring that idea to fruition is something that is an option that perhaps not many trainees are exposed to. What role do you think the training program should have in bringing that to light? And more specifically, what role do you think that the APS could play in bringing some idea development through the pathway, ultimately through the FDA pathway?
I think that's an important issue, and it isn't emphasized very much at all. I know certainly in my early days of research, there wasn't much discussion about that. But, I mean, science has changed enormously over the last 40 years from the types of things that we do. I mean, we didn't even have hand calculators when we started out, and the idea of doing statistics was quite a chore without computers at that time. But our whole approach towards science has changed enormously. And the idea of the gentlemanly attitude that, okay, well, he published the paper and therefore this idea belongs to them or to the university that you're working with, that's not really true. Anyone can pick up that idea and run with it. And that one needs to be careful about revolutionary ideas that have been generated, such that there is some kind of documentation that occurs. Now, it's very different than a journal article. If you publish a journal article, even in a high-impact journal, it doesn't really require someone to reference what you've done. They could just walk around it and choose not to mention the fact that you did that. However, if you have intellectual property and that you have a patent in place, it's a legal document that cannot be avoided. And it needs to be recognized, which gives pharmaceutical companies and companies an opportunity to pursue an idea.
Give the platform protection. It was just in the news this morning of how the 3 most prescribed pharmaceuticals are experiencing a multifold increase in cost based on the investment that these pharmaceutical companies have made into drugs that have not sold. So when you talk about interdisciplinary approach and protection of ideas, and our parent discipline as the APS has a lot to offer and to teach in that, how do you think that they could help with the trainee programs to make sure that that competency perhaps is considered significant enough that it's incorporated into the umbrella training programs, the interdisciplinary training programs, but from the APS's perspective?
I think that there should be some training along those lines because the regulatory issues today are very different than they were 30, 40 years ago. I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, if you were at one institution and I was at another institution and we had an idea and we wanted to work together on it, I could send you samples, I could send you data back and forth, and we would just collaborate on a sort of a handshake with it. Now, for us to do those sorts of things, we need to have material transfer agreements in place, confidentiality agreements in place, and it's not us that is demanding that. The universities are requiring that because there are a lot of legal issues involved in terms of making those kinds of transitions. And I think it should be part of a postdoc's training that they learn some of these principles in terms of the changing world that we're living in.
Yeah. So I want to lighten up a little bit here. How would you compare your experiences at this meeting to your experiences at your very first meeting that you went to for the APS or FASIB?
Yes. My first FASIB meeting was in 1974 in Atlantic City. And the meeting has come a long way, and I don't mean in terms of 3,000 miles across the country, but the way the meeting is organized, the way, and certainly with social media and computers and all, the way of communicating is much better. But the things have changed enormously. I mean, in those days, you were it was a much smaller community of individuals, and you were shoulder to shoulder with the people that were writing those chapters in the handbook of physiology, and you could see them lecturing. And when you got up to give a presentation, there was a high probability that they were in the audience and would be asking you a question, which was in some ways terrifying. Yet at the same time, it was an important experience in that you got direct feedback from the individuals who made the very first discoveries. So there's both the positive and negative aspects of it in terms of we've come a long way, the exhibits, the science, and everything is improved enormously, but the personal education factor and personal communication factor has changed also.
So if you were to summarize the role that the APS has had in your career development and what advice you would give to colleagues, both trainees, evolving colleagues, colleagues who have contributed to your training, and colleagues that you have trained, what would you say to them about the role that APS has had in your career?
I think that from the very beginning, I had some very good mentors, and I recall, almost like it was yesterday, that the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania in the physiology department, in the very beginning, when I was a postdoc, said, you need to join the American Physiological Society. You need to be a card-carrying physiologist, because that's your roadmap in terms of they will help guide you, because you need to publish in those journals, and because they're very prominent journals, high-impact journals, and your credibility depends upon that. So, and when I think back on it, when I was in high school, and even as an undergraduate, I never really thought so much about physiology as a field. It wasn't really until I became a postdoc that I saw the importance of physiology in terms of how the body functions. I mean, originally as an engineer, you take basic science and you use it practically. And physiology is extremely practical in terms of how things work. Now, over the years, we have gotten more and more focused, going from the integrated body organ system to molecular pathways, but it's still how things function. And at the end of the day, I think you really need to ask yourself, would you do it again? And I have to say yes.
Well, Tom, it's really been a pleasure interviewing you, and thank you for the opportunity for sharing your career journey and your future plans to continue to contribute to the wellness of all people that you come across.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.